Buonasera, everyone. I think most of you know, but just a quick little bio review. I'm Anne Robichaud, and will be reborn Italian in my next life. I'm not Italian American at all. I'm married to Pino Alagna from Palermo, Sicily. We have 3 delightful children and 3 adorable little grandsons right now, 2 in California and 1 right here in Assisi. I am the only authorized guida regionale dell'Umbria that is American and succeeded in passing the atrocious exam some years ago. For years, Pino and I worked the land, and I also ran an English language school here outside of Assisi. And now my focus is sharing the wonders of the art and history of the region of Umbria called Italy's Green Heart. My talk today is entitled Discovering the Center of the World, Foligno. Foligno is a town that many people visiting Umbria neglect to visit because they're first going to visit the famous medieval centers, above all Assisi, Gubbio, Montefalco, Bevagna, Perugia, Orvieto, Todi. We've talked about them all. That will keep you busy for many days, just this itinerary. But don't miss Foligno. It might be looked over. Why? Because much of the architecture is contemporary architecture due to quite serious devastation in World War II, Allied bombings in 1943, 1944. But there are medieval and Renaissance treasures in Foligno, one of them being the 12th century church, all restored inside. This is the Church of San Feliciano, which we can see in the photo on the main square. We won't be visiting it today on my talk, also because it is under restoration. When you come to Foligno, we'll visit it together. So off we go to Foligno, called in the dialect of Foligno, il centro del mondo, which means in Italian, il centro del mondo. They often call it il centro del mondo, and the Folignati will tell you that probably this is an appellation given to the town as far back as the Roman period. The town was inhabited as early as the 7th century BC by that native Italic people called the Umbri. Let us remember that the Umbri were the native Italic people settling the area, which would be, as you look at a map of Italy, east of the Tiber. So Assisi, Bevagna, Montefalco, Gubbio were all Umbri. West of the Tiber, who did we have but the Etruscans? The Etruscans were never here in Foligno. The Umbri were here, and by about the 3rd century BC, this is a Roman city. It flourishes because it is not far from the Roman consular road, the Via Flaminia, built in 220 BC by the Roman consul Caius Flaminius to connect the empire with 2 parts of the empire, Rome, and then all the way to the empire in the Middle East, because Via Flaminia ends near the Adriatic Sea. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Foligno was ravaged by invasions from the north, by those people with beards. The Romans were clean-shaven. The barbarians, barbari, the bearded ones, coming from the areas of present-day Germany and so forth, European countries of the north. But it prospered under Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century, and it prospered as a Ghibelline city. Let's remember that terminology, Ghibelline, supporting imperial power. It's a long word like emperor. Guelphs supported papal power. Guelph is a short word like pope. So there was constant warfare throughout central Italy between Guelphs and Ghibellines. The Guelphs were combating with the Ghibellines for domination of the area. And in 1305, the powerful Guelph family, the Trincis, succeeded in dominating the city. They become deputies for the popes later and for the Holy See. They seized power and they maintained control until the early 15th century. This is the let me just show you an image. This is an old print giving you an idea of Foligno at the time of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period. And here we can see the coat of arms, the stemma della famiglia Trinci. And the palace today houses the city museum, the painting gallery, a section of antiquity with objects that date from the 7th and 6th century BC to the 3rd century AD, stupendous frescoes like you see here, a very impressive courtyard into Palazzo Trinci, built between the late 14th and early 15th century. A noted historian has termed the palazzo, and let me read you his quote, l'enciclopedia figurata della cultura umanistica dell'epoca, a figurative encyclopedia of the humanist culture of the period. And it is, because the frescoes in this palace are absolutely stupendous. These are frescoes in the Trinci family chapel in the palace. And the city prospered under papal reign. It is under papal reign in the 15th century and the 16th century, and it is under direction of the papal vicar, assistant to the Pope, Ugolino Trinci, who is the promoter of many of the wonderful fresco works in the Trinci Palace. At this time, the land holdings of the Trinci were on the increase as the Trinci family dominated such towns as Assisi, Spello, Bevagna, Trevi, Montefalco. With the conclusion of the Trinci dominion in 1439, the palace became the seat of the papal governors, because at that time Umbria is part of the papal states, and it will remain seat of the papal government until the unification of Italy in 1860. There's another extraordinary palace in Foligno which must be visited, the Palazzo Orfini. It's the 15th century palace, and it is the Museo della Stampa, the museum of the printing, the printed works. And this was the family palace of the Orfini family, and they were Zecchieri del Papa, which means the minters, those who minted the papal coins. The minting family of the papacy. And in Palazzo Orfini, you can see today in the Museo della Stampa one of Foligno's treasures, the first copy ever printed of the Divine Comedy. And it was printed by Johann Neumeister, who was an apprentice of Gutenberg, and he worked with a local printer, Evangelista Angelini. And the first printed copy of the Divine Comedy, printed in 1472, is one of the treasures of Foligno today. So when we go to Foligno together, we'll certainly visit Palazzo Trinci, which I'll be talking more about, and we'll visit the Palazzo Orfini to visit the wonderful Museo della Stampa, the Museum of Printing. And when you enter Palazzo Trinci, you already have a sense of the power of this family. In the impressive courtyard with the grand staircase. The palace has undergone restoration, a little bit of the back history of it. Over the years, it has been offices of the local court. It was state offices. It was offices of the local police. An earthquake of 1831, 1832 heavily damaged it. You may remember that that was the same earthquake which damaged the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels in Assisi, which we talked about. And we remember that that was all restored after the earthquake of the mid-19th century. And the World War II bombings of Foligno also caused some serious damage to this palace. So the modern neoclassical facade of the palace, this facade, neoclassical, was built after the 19th century earthquake. So here is the facade of the Palazzo Trinci. We're going to see the frescoes in this covered area. It's a covered walkway, which is called the corridoio, a corridor, which connects Palazzo Trinci to the Cathedral of San Feliciano. He was patron saint of Foligno, and the church dedicated to him. It was started in the 12th century. It's been restored much over the years. This is an old photo I found of the municipal piazza of Foligno. You can see Palazzo Trinci. I think this photo was taken in about 1946. And here you can see a little bit more of the cathedral, the corridor connecting the two buildings. Now, when you go into the courtyard today to visit the museum, you'll go up this grand staircase, restored, not the original staircase. And an interesting room is the loggia. And the loggia was frescoed in the early 15th century. And it was frescoed by Gentile da Fabriano, at least it's attributed to him. We might have mentioned him in my talk on the Cathedral of Orvieto, because one of his famous frescoes is in the Cathedral of Orvieto. And he was the protagonist, this is early 15th century, of the International Gothic. An International Gothic is a bridge between the Gothic and Renaissance art, and it's characterized by elegant secular chivalry. But I'd like to read you information that I read from a noted art historian about the characteristics of the International Gothic art. And this art historian wrote, it is giving to us an elegant, delicate realism which perfectly suited the decorative needs of the royal court, which gave birth to it. It's marked by a feeling of secular chivalry, and no matter how devotional or religious the object, its elegance reflects the sophisticated cosmopolitan nature and pageantry of courtly life. So International Gothic. It was not known that these frescoes were done by Gentile da Fabriano. I think the theory that these were his frescoes just was written about recently. I'm thinking within the last 100 years, they attributed this to Gentile da Fabriano. In the loggia, the frescoes are depicting scenes of Romulus and Remus, and the purpose is deliberately to associate the founders of Rome with the Trinci family. The frescoes throughout the palace are emphasizing the power of the Trincis and their importance as the center of Foligno and the culture of Foligno, just as Romulo and Remo, I guess you say Romulus and Remo in English, correct? Romulo and Remo were the center of the foundation of the civilization of Rome. And so their images are depicted in this loggia. And if you look closely at these frescoes, you can see that the scenes of Romulo and Remo are not depicted in ancient Rome, but they're depicted in perhaps the city of Foligno. Certainly the scenes take place in elegant Renaissance buildings. One beautiful feature of the Palazzo Trinci is the Scala Gotica. It's called the Gothic staircase, built between 1390 and 1400, later restored, and it's connecting two different levels of the palace. It's an absolutely exquisite staircase, as you can see. Near the top of the Gothic staircase, one enters the Cappella del Palazzo, or the Palace of the Chapel, and it was all frescoed by Ottaviano Nelli, who was from Gubbio in the early 15th century. And this was the family palace of the Trinci family. And the images are all about, for the most part, we should say, the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I'm going to zero in for you on this crucifixion scene. You can see the crucifixion, you can see the adoration, the nativity and so forth. Here you can see the Annunciation. But let's zero in on the crucifixion. Because who do we have at the foot of the cross? Well, we have the Virgin. Remember that the most important position is the right, destra. It's more important than the left, sinistra, because we'd all rather be more dexterous than sinister, wouldn't we? So on the right is the Virgin. On the left is the Magdalene. But on the right also is San Feliciano, born in 160, died in 249 AD, patron saint of Foligno and bishop of the Roman area of the period. At that time, the city of Foligno was called Fulginie. Later in the Middle Ages, Fulginium. So he was a bishop of near Fulginie. And we have him on the right, and on his left, on the left of Christ, we have another important saint. These were both saints very dear to the Trinci family. The patron saint San Feliciano and Beato Paoluccio Trinci. Blessed Paoluccio Trinci. He is blessed. He was a Franciscan of the 14th century, and he was born, into a noble family, the Trincis. And also another saint very much beloved of by the Trinci family was San Francesco. This is a detail of Francis receiving the stigmata. Here are more exquisite frescoes in this chapel, La Cappella del Palazzo Trinci. This is called Dormitio Virginis, the death of the Virgin Mary. Another exquisite room of the Palazzo Trinci is called the Sala dei Giganti, or the Room of the Giants. And the Room of the Giants depicts, it's also called the Room of the Emperors, because it depicts Roman emperors. And here, what are we doing? But also creating a parallel between them and the Trincis. So the purpose of this room, too, is to show off the power and the importance of the Trinci family. And there are 20 personages, and they alternate, because they're not all, they call it the Room of the Giants or the Room of the Emperors. They're not all emperors. They're 20 personages. They're both men of war, uomini di guerra, and men of politics, uomini di politica. And they're not necessarily in chronological order. Here are a couple more scenes from this room. They're all huger than life size, and they're all in exquisite Renaissance dress. They're not in classical dress. They're not wearing togas at all. And then one of the most beautiful rooms of this palace is the room called the Sala delle Arti Liberali e dei Pianetti by Gentile da Fabriano. It was frescoed between 1411 and 1412. This is the room of the liberal arts and of the planets. And the maestro frescoed this most exquisite room. It's said to be the most exquisite room in all of Palazzo Trinci. And he's giving us frescoes of the liberal arts, including the trivium. Okay, the trivium literally means the three ways, three vie, the trivium, three ways to learn, for example. And the trivium includes grammatica, look at that stunning fresco, retorica, which we'd call rhetoric, a dialectica. And dialectica is trying to hold on to a serpent in the sense of struggle depicted in dialectica. And also depicted is the quadrivium, which means the four ways. So the liberal arts have the trivium, 3 of them, the quadrivium, 4 of them. And the quadrivium includes musica, and it also includes, I went backwards here, arithmetic and astronomy and geometry as well. So here we have music. I don't have an image of geometry, but I do have arithmetic, aritmetica on the left, Astronomia, which is there on the right. At the other end of the room, we want to take this out here. At the other, whoops, excuse me. I didn't mean to have that word in there. At the other end of the room, we have images of the planets, the 7 planets, and the 7 ages of men. For example, the sun, depicted with vecchiaia, old age. The moon, depicted with decrepitude. Mercury, with the winged feet, depicted within the roundel infancy, infancia. Here we have Jove clutching a fistful of arrows, Jupiter, and he is depicted in the roundel representing the age of man called adolescence, adolescenza. And the beautiful border along the top of this room is all intertwining roses, because the roses were the symbol of the Trinci family. There is an exquisite art museum in this room, and we're going to talk about one particular painting. It's a copy. It's a copy by Enrico Bartolomei, actually not Bartolomei, but Bartolomei, and it was done in the late 19th century, and it is a copy of the famous Madonna of Foligno by Raffaello, which was painted from 1511 to 1512. And in 2014, the Madonna of Raphael returned home. And I want to read you what I wrote at that time. I was at the show to see this Madonna of Foligno returning to Foligno after years away, and I was just totally overcome. I wrote this at the time. People might line up to see a president, to ask a star's autograph, to shake hands with a music idol, to kiss a pope's ring, or to curtsy to a queen. I stood in a line for nearly 2 hours, twice, to gaze on a queen, Raphael's Madonna di Foligno. His masterpiece was painted in 1512 when he was 29 years old. He dies very young. He's under 40 years old when he dies. And in 2014, the Madonna of Raffaello returned to Foligno for a week. And there were 8,000 people in lines to see her. 240,000 people had gone to see her when she was on display in Milan. Now, the Madonna di Raffaello was painted, as mentioned, in 1512. It was to be in the Church of the Araceli in Rome. The painter's commissioner, the commissioner of the painting, Sigismondo Conti, who was a nobleman of Foligno, died. His niece later brings the Madonna di Raffaello to Foligno when she enters the monastery of Sant'Anna, the convent of Sant'Anna. And what happens? It's taken away by the French at the end of the 18th century. And I want to read you this. This was the taking away in the French. This is how it went. It was hauled out of the Monastero di Sant'Anna and loaded onto an oxen cart in 1797 by the Napoleonic French. And the breathtaking Madonna came home in 2014 in a climate-controlled case in a truck under escorted armed guard. And the 10 sisters of the Monastero of Sant'Anna tremulously sang her a welcome of Ave Maria, not without tears. I didn't hear them sing the welcome, but I was able to see the beautiful Madonna of Raphael. Now, where is she? She's in the Vatican Museum. So she was commissioned by Sigismondo de' Conti, who was a chamberlain for Pope Julius II. Julius II was the one who commissioned Michelangelo to do the Moses for his tomb. In 1568, she comes to the Monastero of Sant'Anna with the niece of this Sigismondi, Anna de' Conti. In 1797, she's taken off to France. In 1816, she returns to Foligno, but the sisters of Sant'Anna sell her to Pius VII because they're in desperate need of greater income. And they sell her for a sum which is far less than she was worth. And at that time, the Madonna of Raffaello enters the Vatican Museum. So let's go back. This is the original. And it was commissioned by someone whose niece will enter the Franciscan convent in Foligno, and who's at the foot, but San Francesco of Assisi, along with John the Baptist. And this is the person who commissioned it, Sigismondo Conti. Look at the detail. Isn't that exquisite? So a copy is in the Palazzo Trinci Museum. And I took these photos in 2014 when I went to see the Madonna di Raffaello. And what I really loved was all over Foligno, in every store. This person sold, I don't know, records and things. The Madonna of Raffaello. This is electrical appliance, the Madonna of Raffaello, in every store. And what was so heartwarming for me were to see the school groups in line waiting to see her. In this Foligno in 2014, when more than 8,000 visitors waited long in line to see the Madonna of Raffaello. These are all the students. Their teacher, they're waiting to go in. Their teacher is giving them notes about the history of the Madonna di Raffaello. They're all asked to write their comments about the painting after they see it. And these are visitors inside the convent called the Monastero di Sant'Anna, the monastery dedicated to Sant'Anna. We remember that in Italian, Monastero is the resident of the sisters. And this is one of the nuns who's giving guided tours of the wonderful frescoes of late 15th, early 16th century of the convent. So a treasure in Palazzo Trinci, the copy, the original back in the Vatican Museum, at one time in this convent here. And Palazzo Trinci also stars during the extraordinary festival celebrating the Baroque period of Foligno, which is the Quintana festival. Celebrations are in June and September. And the 10 districts or rioni of Foligno compete. There is a justing match. And this is Palazzo Trinci, and this is the corridor of the Palazzo, which connects Palazzo Trinci. See these frescoes here? This is in the room of the liberal arts. And this is the corridor connecting it to the church of the cathedral, that is of San Felice. Here you can see the neoclassical facade. This is illuminated. This looks like it's the room of the giants here. This is illuminated during the festivities of the Quintana. Now the Quintana. This is celebrated twice a year in June and September. And it is related to it is a justing match, but it's related to the ancient history of Foligno. And it is a pre-Lenten festival, if you will. It was at one time a Carnevale festival, that is a Mardi Gras. Today it is in September and in June, as mentioned. And horsemen, one for each district, gallop at breakneck speed on a challenging course with a lance, and they're aiming it at the Quintano statue holding 3 rings. And this is the Giostra della Quintana. This is the Quintano statue. This is the 15th century statue. And they're aiming at 3 rings. And these are the coats of arms of the 10 different districts. And for me, the elegant pageantry of the night before is the highlight, when over 700 personages gather. This is the Quintano here. And also what is delightful is the whole week before, the different districts open the taverna, or their medieval eating places. This is the taverna of Giotti with the blue. And when I went there with friends to eat not long ago, outside were some of the personages in their stunning, stunning Baroque costumes. These costumes, I think they were telling me they can cost as much as, some of them rent them, some of them they're in their family. One costume can cost as much as, $20,000. And I talked to one of the tailors. Let's see if I've got a picture of him. Yes. This is a tailor. He told me his name was Signor Parigi, but I believe Signor Parigi, he meant to tell me that he was working for a group of tailors called Sartoria Parigi. That is the tailor group of Parigi. And I talked to him, and he proudly illustrated his costumes to me in shades of soft blue, various shades of whites. And he said this, as he's showing me the costumes, he says, this one is modeled on a painting of Velázquez. This one was worn by a 17th century Bourbon princess. And I designed this one from a gold embroidered Baroque altar frontispiece. So this is the creative designer of these costumes. And you can see the great pride. People here of the Jyoti district. I believe that this is the one that he said is from the painting by Velázquez. Now let us see the Quintana. And the head, the organization called the Giostra della Quintana allowed me to show you this video, and I want to thank them. There are events the nights before the justing match throughout Foligno. These are some of the horsemen of the justing match. This is Palazzo Trinci. This is near Palazzo Trinci. This is in front of Palazzo Trinci, City Hall. You can see how exquisite the costumes are. And the great pride. They're carrying the tapestries representative of their districts, the horsemen, and this is the Giostra of the Quintana. See, he's going to run that lance through the three rings. I don't know if he was successful or not. This looks like Jyoti. He's in blue. Isn't that amazing? I don't know if they ran the justing match last year, the year before, no, because of COVID. I think they did it last year. I think this year they're definitely having a Giostra. And they will, look at the people going wild, and they will have the festivities in June. So this is Giostra della Quintana. And these are some of the evening celebrations here. These are some of the evening banquets. Um, 700 personages dress for this. That's a rather risque one, isn't it? And the food served is also authentic to the period. And not everybody participating is from Foligno, because people that come from all over Italy. A woman I know in Assisi always dressed for the Quintana as one of the noble women. So the Quintana of Foligno. Early June, end of September. there is more than one exquisite church in Foligno, but one certainly that we want to mention is Santa Maria Infra Portas, built 11th century, 12th century, and 13th century, and probably earlier, because they think there was a sacred edifice on this site as early as the 6th, 7th century. Santa Maria Infra Portas is on Piazza San Domenico. Near it is the Church of San Domenico, which is a church of the Dominican order, medieval, 13th, 14th century. It's now the concert hall of Foligno. Foligno is a city of bicycles. It's flat. A lot of biking in Foligno. When they restored this church in the 18th century, they restored it in a style that we would call really unhappy restoration. They do use the medieval columns of the 11th, 12th century, but the rose window was replaced by a bifore, or a bipartite window, done in the 18th, 19th century. Also, this portico here is not the original portico of the church. Here's an old print of Santa Maria Infra Portas, and this will be just, this is well over 100 years old, a couple hundred years old probably. I just want to show you some details of the exquisitely sculpted columns, sculpted in local travertine, and let's go in. Extensively restored, yes, in the 18th century, but fortunately, many exquisite frescoes remain on the pilasters throughout the church, and we're just going to look at a couple of them. But before we look at some of the artwork on the pilasters, we're going to go to the left as we go in, and this is the oldest religious edifice in Foligno. It is called the Chapel of the Assumption, l'Assunta, or sometimes of San Pietro, because over the altar we have a depiction of Christ between the saints Peter and Paul. It's a 12th century fresco of Byzantine style. We're not sure who the artist was. You can see, let's go back. Below the saints are sort of holding the rod of an exquisite tapestry hanging down, which we would call Byzantineggiante, very Byzantine in its flavor. The artist is unknown. We have prancing lions in roundels here, all decorated. And as we come out of the chapel, we want to check the frescoes of a couple pilasters. This is San Rocco. Both of them are San Rocco. You might recognize him. He's that 12th century saint who assisted people suffering from the bubonic plague on their way to Rome. He's always pointing to the pustule he has on his thigh. And the one on the left was painted by a famous painter of Foligno. His full name is Pier Antonio Mesastris, 15th century. It's thought that the one on the right, which comes later, might have been painted by his very own son, Bernardino Mesastris. Another famous painter of Foligno, who frescoes on two other pilasters of the church, is Niccolò di Liberatore detto l'Alunno. Niccolò, son of Liberatore, sometimes called l'Alunno, and he frescoes in the late 15th century. The fresco on the right is Christ carrying his cross, and on the left is St. Peter Martyr. He was a Dominican saint of the 12th century, martyred with his head split open, and he's always depicted with his iconographic symbol of a huge knife slitting his skull. He was, I believe, from the area of near Verona. And then on two other, wall actually of the church are lovely frescoes, by Pier Antonio Mesastris, and they're late 15th century. We're not sure if the one on the right is Mesastris. Maybe. We're not really sure. The one on the left, yes. And I believe it's documented. This is St. Jerome, hermit saint. and a cardinal who leave behind his cardinalship in Rome to head out to the desert. He's being crowned here by the angels. And the saint on the right, if you recognize the wheel, you'll know that's Catherine of Alexandria, who was drawn and quartered on the wheel. And her iconographic symbol is always the wheel. And here is the position, so you can see it, of the two saints, Saint Jerome and Catherine of Alexandria. You could see they're on one of the pilasters under an arch here in the church. This is a contemporary painting over here. And these are actually delightful. We have Sant'Amico and Santa Lucia. Now, Sant'Amico, this is one thing I love about exploring Foligno. You see things you've never seen before, including this fresco. And I had never heard of Sant'Amico. And Sant'Amico was an 11th century Benedictine saint. He lived in the Marches region. And look below him, his iconographic symbol. It is a wolf bearing an old wooden saddle. And what is the story? The story is that he lived in a Benedictine convent in the Marches region. This is 11th century. And a wolf attacked the donkey, I think ripped it apart, destroyed, devastated the donkey, which was the beast of burden of the friars. And he was so clever at taming the wolf and calming it down that he trained the wolf to replace the donkey as the beast of burden for the friars. So he's got a one-upmanship here on Francis of Assisi, who they say 200 years later will tame the wolf of Gubbio. But Saint Amico succeeded in taming the wolf so well that he could saddle it. Isn't that something? Such a delightful story. I had never heard of it until I visited Foligno and read about Sant'Amico. Who is this Sant'Amico? The saint friend. This is Santa Lucia, her eyes on a plate. I believe she was martyred in the early 4th century, for certain in Syracuse, Sicily, and her eyes were plucked out, so she's always depicted iconographic symbols. She's holding her eyes on a plate. These frescoes are both by Pier Antonio Mezzastris of Foligno. Now, this was a surprise on a recent visit, thanks to our daughter Julia. She told Pino and myself about the Calamita Cosmica. And this is a 24-meter long statue, a mammoth sculpture by a contemporary artist, Gino de Dominicis. I believe he died in 1998. And his sculpture is in an 18th century deconsecrated church. This is the church of the Trinità in Foligno. And Pino and I recently visited this, and there is Pino looking at the poster of the Calamita Cosmica. Now, I deliberately mispronounced this. By accident, I mispronounced it, but it's interesting. Something I read about an art historian's article on this. Calamita means calamity, but calamita means magnet. And this is really the cosmic magnet. But this art historian wrote and said it could well be also called the cosmic calamity, the statue. Now, there was a very interesting exhibit before you went in, and some of the photos showed what it looked like when they moved this statue into this church. Can you imagine what an endeavor that was? The church was heavily damaged in an earthquake in 1997, and it was subsequently restored by the region of Umbria, together with the bank, the Cassa di Risparmio di Foligno, and the Cassa di Risparmio di Foligno bought the Calamita Cosmica from the sculptor. And the mammoth sculpture was installed, not without difficulties, as you can see, in 2011. So this is really something, Rick, you probably wouldn't have seen this when you were in Foligno, that's for sure. He was born in Ancona in 1947, the artist, Gino de Dominicis, and his first exhibit was at the age of 17. He was an intriguing personality. For over 20 years, no one really knew where he lived. And his addresses he gave different hotels in Rome. And they say he was a nocturnal creature working at night, and he was known and mysterious, untraceable, and he actually died alone in 1998. And the sculpture was done between 1988 and 1989. And Pino was looking with curiosity at the nose, which is like a beak. And I'd like to read you what I read about it. An art historian said, according to him, he had talked to De Dominicis. He desired to provoke in the observer a sense of inferiority and the insignificance of man before something unattainable and something sovrumano, which literally means above the human or superhuman. And he said that De Dominicis intended it to be the magnet, placing the skeleton in contact with the cosmic world. And in fact, let me see if I can show it to you. You see this rod here? He wanted the whole statue to be covered in gold. It never was. There's some people observing it. And this is a view area from the top. And he's holding a rod, which is gold-covered aluminum. And this is the magnet connecting the skeleton, that is us, with the cosmic world. Italo Tomasini, who's the museum director and an art critic, wrote, "The feet are a Gothic prodigy of bones, like spires and pinnacles." You see these feet? "Pointing to the sky like the golden rod that activates," here's the golden rod, "the gravitational field, indicating an unreachable elsewhere and an initiatory journey to the light of the origin." There's Pino taking his photo, standing between the feet. And I took this photo at the feet looking up towards the torso. These are two photos of our visit to the cosmic magnet, you'd literally translate it. The artist said this, "A work of art is a living object that to exist does not need to be seen." But certainly when you're in Foligno, you need to see this. And something else you need to see, many things we need to see when we go to Foligno. We need to knock on the door, you can see on the left, to have the sisters open for us the Monastero di Sant'Anna, the convent of Sant'Anna, also called Il Monastero delle Contesse, because one of the first women to enter this monastero, convent, was a countess, Angelina, and she later became Blessed Beata Angelina, was born near Orvieto at the end of the 14th century. And the convent is founded by the Franciscan of the Trinci family, Paoluccio Trinci, the Franciscan, at the end of the 14th century. Over the door is a Mezzastri's fresco of the Virgin and Child, Pier Antonio Mezzastris. He frescoes this this is when he lived, He lived from 1457 to 1506. This was probably done at the end of the 15th century. And this is an image of the Virgin with Child. And on her right is Sant'Anna, because this is the convent dedicated to her. And this is Beata Angelina, who was a countess, and she gives up her wealth to enter this convent, and it becomes the convent of what is called in Italian the Terziarie Regolare Francescane, the regular tertiary Franciscans. And a group of noble women will join her in the spiritual life. And that is why this convent is also called the Convent of the Countesses, Il Convento delle Contesse. And when you enter and you're into the first cloister, you see these magnificent monochrome frescoes, and they were done between the late 15th century and the early 16th century. And this is a visit that I took alone with Andres, who's helping me here on my talk right now. I think Andres took this photo. And the day after my visit with Andres, I went back there to see the frescoes with my husband Pino, and he was fascinated to talk to Suora Clotilde. And in many ways, I have to thank her and dedicate this talk also to Suora Clotilde, an extraordinary woman. She's one of the Franciscan tertiary regulars, in English would be the word, living in this convent. I believe she's been a religious for over 50 years. I believe her dissertation, if I understood her from university, was on the life of Beata Angelina. And Pino was extremely curious at the monochromatic tone of these frescoes. And he said, why this particular green color? This is often called the Chiostro Verde, the green cloister. And she said, they were painted with green earth. And these frescoes over the door, we see God the Father, for example. Most of the frescoes are about the life of the Virgin, but also about the life of Christ. Some of these are by also an Assisi artist called L'Ingegno. This is another many exquisite rooms in here, each with artistic treasures. She took us in to see what was called the Oratory of Blessed Angelina. And she's pointing out to Pino the exquisite frescoes also on the ceiling by Giovanni of Corraduccio. His nickname was Mazzaforte. And he frescoed in the early 15th century. And look who we have at the foot of the cross. Francis of Assisi. Because we remember that, number one, this will be a Franciscan convent. Number two, he was a beloved saint of the Trinci family. And she later pointed out this to us. She's kind of laughing about it. Well, she was just thrilled with the fresco, and she was laughing about something that she'd heard about Mezzastris when he frescoed this. But she'd also pointed out to us that this was a centurion, assisting at Christ's burial, who's pointing at Christ as if to say to us, she was telling us this, look at him. He died for us. He is the one to follow. You see him pointing to the Christ crucified. And here's Francis at the foot of the cross. The most important position on the right will go to his mother and, of course, the Magdalene. And John the Beloved is here. This was exquisitely beautiful, the Tree of Life, by Giovanni di Corraduccio. Also this, we'd seen something else that he had done, the Oratory. This is early 15th century. And this is called La più antica figurativa pittura del monastero. This is the oldest figurative painting of the monastery. The Tree of Life, Christ crucified, and surround him this beautiful vegetation, and holding scrolls are 12 prophets. And absolutely delightful. Rick and some of my viewers who saw my Italian talk on Italian gestures. Oh, how I would have loved to know about this fresco. Just look at these gestures, pointing, what are you going to do about it? Pazienza, who, me? Every single look at him. Every single gesture is just a delight. How about this one? Oh, let me think about it. This guy seems to be saying, don't ask me, ask him. Or you should have gone back that way. Absolutely delightful. I'd love to do another talk just on gestures in Italian art. We'll have to think about that, right? And here's some other frescoes of the church, which she was showing to me. Here she's talking about this beautiful fresco by Mezzastris of St. Francis receiving the stigmata. This is San Feliciano, and he's surrounded by penitents here. But I want to zero in on Francis receiving the stigmata here. Pier Antonio Mezzastris, and we know the date, 1487, because it was inscribed in the bell tower of the church. And we can see him here. He's praying on Mount Laverne in Tuscany. It's said that the seraphim appears before him. The winged angel, remember his favorite follower was with him, Brother Leo, Frate Leone. Intense light coming down to his hands, feet, and his side. And this is quite an early representation in art, which will become eventually Renaissance art, of Francis receiving the stigmata. We don't know who did this early 16th century fresco, but it is of Sant'Anna. The convent or monastero is named after her. And on her right is Elizabeth of Hungary. She is founder of the Franciscan tertiaries, the Franciscan lay people. She was married, she was nobility, but she tried to live the Franciscan spirit. We call her the first of the Franciscan tertiaries. And Sant'Anna is patting the head as if to say, she's the one I have to love. This is Blessed Angelina, the countess, who will enter this convent established by Paoluccio Trinci of the noble Trinci family, who becomes a Franciscan. Another surprise in this convent. We must go see it together. And I think they found out about these graffiti not long ago. I'm thinking the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. She showed us a section of the convent which is called the House of the Painter. And this is end of the 15th century. You can see the date is here. Let's see, this is 1453, 73. And this is IHS, the symbol of St. Bernard of Siena, Jesus Hominum Salvatorum, who was a great Franciscan preacher. And he preaches throughout Umbria in 1425. And this is the part of the building which was called the House of the Painters. And this is where Niccolò Alunno, famous painter, worked. And many painters worked, and the walls are covered with their graffiti. And she pointed out to us in detail some graffiti. There's coins of the period. And here is a portrait of Niccolò Alunno. This is his wife, Caterina. And this is a nude that he's drawn on the wall. So absolutely stunning just to see the graffiti in the House of the Painters. Suora Clotilde pointed out also to us a very, very early painting of Niccolò di Liberatore called L'Alunno. This is early 15th century. He was a very young man when he painted this Christ crucified, the Virgin at the foot of the cross, and John the Beloved. So it's thanks to Suora Clotilde that we were able to see so many exquisite treasures in this church in Foligno, this convent. And it's just one of the many places in Foligno with countless hidden treasures. So let's go together. Suora Clotilde is waiting for us. She said, I'd be delighted to meet some of your American friends. So hope you can join me. And thanks for being here today to discover with me the center of the world, Foligno. Grazie.